Okay, Josh, you ready for the first question?
Anytime.
Okay. Ecology and poetics. You think about poetics, if you think about contemporary poetics, modern and contemporary, you think Williams liked the machine, you know, everybody liked the built environment.
Yeah.
And yet what you're doing, and Evelyn and others, you're trying to think about species time and poetry. So go ahead, try to identify for people who may not know much about it, what is ecopoetics?
Yeah. Well, okay. And first of all, I'll just say the obligatory, I love being here. I'm so thrilled to see old and new friends and to just know this place is one of the best
It's
places
still
ever.
around.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh, for all the work you did at the beginning to make
Yeah.
this place.
So to answer the question, though, I'll even start by saying I don't see the built environment or the machine as non-ecological. They have ecological effects and frame how we think about, who we are and what we're doing. So you have to include that, as well as, species, human, non-human relationships, and how those are important and changing. Landscape, planet, and different. So different kinds of specific kinds of relationships. So plants, trees, rivers, mountains, rocks. All of this has incredibly long poetic history. And I like to say, like, the word verse also means to turn a plow. So you have landscape and poetics were constantly synthesized from the beginning, and sometimes that that has come in and out of focus, and it's now back in focus, and that's what sort of where ego.
Why is it now back in focus? I mean, there's an obvious reason, but what's the less obvious reason?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, the environmental movement, really starting in the '60s, woke us all up to what was going on in small and large scales, and that has become a whole way of seeing and being, and writing, obviously, and that's what this kind of poetics is interested in.
Evelyn, would you be willing to respond to any part of what Josh just said?
Yeah. I mean, I tend to think that in the world we live now, there is no non-eco anything. I mean, I have trouble when it's like trying to be defined as a genre, or gee, there's just lots of kinds of poetry, and eco-poetry is one of them, and which one are you interested in?
That actually
Maybe.
makes you kind of mad, doesn't it?
Well, it's a little bit in parallel.
Oh, you're an eco-poet. You're one of those people.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't mind I'm happy to be one of those people, but I think just because of where we are in the world, it's kind of like saying climate change is one of many interesting issues, and are you interested in that? To me, it's like we're in a moment of rethinking the world, and part of rethinking the world is rethinking language and the way it's shaping the way we think about our world. So it just seems like a moment when everything is being rethought, whether it's architecture, language, poetry, anything you're doing needs to be filtered through this lens, because here we are together. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that helps or not, but I kind of tend to think of it that way. Mm-hmm. Like it must be in our work.
Yeah.
I noticed when styrofoam came out, it bore with it, by way of a blurb, a question from John Ashbery. I'm going to read the question and actually ask you to answer it, but also Josh. So first there's a comment by Ashbery and then the question. A vast Sargasso sea, this is about Evelyn's book Styrofoam, which I highly recommend. A vast Sargasso sea of plastic fragments the size of a continent have been discovered in the Pacific Ocean. Here's the question. How do we go about living in what Evelyn Reilly defines as our infinite plasticity, prosperity, plenitude, and still have room for poetry?
You're asking me that?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, John there was falling prey to the separation of categories.
Yeah.
Poetry on one side and styrofoam the size of a continent in one of our oceans.
Right. Well, the way I deal with that, because it's really like, what are these places in your life? I do think as a poet there is no non-eco, so that just means everything filters in. But I just as a human being, and given the time frame of this issue that we have to deal with, I guess I always think, well, you have to do your work and have the world infiltrate your work. But I think you also have to be a citizen. So I think a lot of poets have a trouble right now finding their place in poetry, and they can get very alienated, like, well, does this really matter? I think it matters the way culture matters. And James has written a lot about environmental culture. What's an environmental culture? But actually, I think you also have citizenship duties that poetry does not fulfill. So I just think, well, if you're engaged deeply in both and just keep going forward, that's how I navigate. I don't know how John did it, but
Well, he partly did it by deciding that the vast Sargasso Sea of plastic fragments was material for poetry.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that was his key strategy.
Yeah.
So the wider the world got of junk, the wider his poetry reached. Josh, how do you respond to John's question or comment?
Yeah, I'm thinking along with Evelyn. Also, I would even say sometimes I feel that being vegetarian or not using single-use plastic is as avant-garde as writing the history and reading the history of avant-garde poetics.
Can we pause to see if anybody will snap for that? Say that again. Say that again, Josh.
Yeah, certainly, the vegetarian, or just and thinking about your energy use and the objects that you touch and what's the history of these objects. And
Is avant-garde.
Is avant-garde,
So
yeah.
define avant-garde in that respect.
Because avant-garde is, pushing the limits of certainly language, perception, form, and sort of, the what you do with form. And plastic pushes our perception. Plastic is amazing. It is avant-garde, and it's in many ways materially. And so we need to know it, but it's also a rival to poetry in a way. It's in its sort of appeal and brightness and sort of sensual qualities. So poetry is about pushing writing as far as it can go, pushing tropes and devices, and sort of experience and sense as far as it can go. And if oil or plastic is doing that in one way, poetry can respond in other ways.
Jean-Michel, and then Josh, you'll get to respond to either or both of the comments.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a question for all of you, and it's a question that I'm asking myself, and it's about the concept you've used a few times of nature.
Yeah.
And it comes to me because I've been reading recently a lot of Marquis de Sade, and you see there a certain concept of nature predicated on crime and murder, incest, and so on. And you can oppose it to other concepts of nature in the 18th century. In the 18th century, you can create a concept of nature. Today, do you think you can still use nature in a rigorous philosophical manner? And can you oppose it to like nature, culture, as we often say, culture, nature? Or are we not a little beyond and having lost maybe that sense that there is something like nature? Simple question.
Yeah, very simple. I don't want to not use the word, but every use is extremely burdened, and certainly don't want to use it as a dichotomy. But there are minerals, and metals in these microphones, and that you can't not think that either. So natural history, human history, machinic history, linguistic history, these are not, these are intersecting phenomena. And that's, to me, what nature means now. As long as you include all those different kinds of intersections in the term. And there is still a place, even in all that, for the non-intersectional, in the sense that there are things that are not about us, right, and out there. How do you imagine something that isn't predicated on your own imagination? that used to be also a giant philosophical question, and it still matters, even in terms of questions around realism, scientific realism especially, and also, or what do things look like without us, either at the center or us controlling what things look like. So those are all, perennial questions. They're not going away, even if we're no longer thrilled with that word nature.
Evelyn, would you pick a passage
Sure.
here and read from Echolocation? I'll ask Josh to respond, and also
Sure.
someone else who wants to respond to this. And by the way, we have copies of both of these books available for sale.
I just wanted to say one thing to your question is, I think we are in a different place, but I think all those issues of embodiment, whether you're coming, there's a kind of re-speaking of embodiment, and a lot of people, part of talking about May Bersenbrugge or other poets, some people come to this kind of work through illness, by the way. I think there's a big body of work now where people start re-languaging the body, and it often is intersecting with medical science and all kinds of different languages, in that way. And I think there are some philosophical traditions that interest me that have never been in that duality. I've been interested in the history of American pragmatism and even neo-pragmatism because they speak a different language about our animal nature and have for a long time. But anyway, I'll just read a short section of this first poem. Probably about a minute. The first poem in this book is called, there's a series of poems called Self, and the first one is called Song of. Approximately 98.6 degrees, all this desire and grieving, just more trouble in the annals of subjectivity, might say Sappho, in the sense that the individual becomes a crystal that can form anywhere, but only an occasional crystal, not a natural category that everyone has, adds a damp book on some cool tiles within reach of a self steeping in possibilities of reassembly, as the jealous lover, the betrayed friend, or perhaps just this ambiguous animal skittish with the notion of identity as a series of equal signs forming any kind of viable ladder, instead of an improvised explosive device that might detonate at any moment, or an act of breaking into a house where children are sleeping, their presence apparent in the loam all over the surfaces, where the self-reflected seems no less ephemeral than the small frog that appears on the sill for a few seconds, then flicks itself back into unfindability, or onto the doorstep of Richard Chamberlain in The Last Wave, becoming the briefest object of the camera's gaze before merging into a chorus forming the soundtrack to a downpour of epic proportions among other fugitive, superpermeable spokes creatures of post-humanity.
Thank you. Josh?
So first of all, I wrote the blurb for the back of the book, which is that I felt this was a series of fantastic poems that are they have a lot of science fiction in them, a lot of sort of what are these future figures, these future selves, and skittish entities, which appeared there, post-human at the end as well. I think, there's a phrase I use a lot lately in teaching and writing and thinking. I talk about transitional poetics or transitional cultures just generally. It's a phrase I'm borrowing from, especially talking about energy. They talk about transitional energy. What do we get after oil? What's the next, and how do we transition to that? But in a broader cultural frame, it's going to be a whole mental shift, and maybe like a shift of the self. And so I think in this book, especially Evelyn Reilly's book, it's very powerful. There's a lot of transitional poetics effects going on between these selves that are sort of emerging, and these phrases and language and devices. So that's, to me, what ecopoetics is going towards right now. Trying to imagine a new kind of, a new kind of poetics, a place where we want to be, or maybe not want to be either. You have to imagine both. And so ecopoetics has got a lot of this sort of science fiction projection, extrapolation going on inside of it too.
Wow, thank you. I have a portable mic, and I'm inviting someone, Julia.
Josh, I remember that you used this really great phrase in a piece, I think on Alison Cobb's book. You referred to left melancholy, and it occurs
Did you say
to
left
left
melancholy?
melancholy in a
There's
lot
a lot of that going
in
around.
a lot of the work that we create in the age of the Anthropocene, or the work that we're creating in order to try to articulate the Anthropocene. And it strikes me that that use of the wave, the image of the wave, in this idea that a poem should invoke not the thing itself, whatever that might be, but the filmic representation of the wave, and this idea of, this fantasy of humanity being washed away. And it's like, I just feel like what I just heard in your poem is this representation nested within another representation, and the temptation is in fact to feel quite melancholic about that, while still having access to something that isn't quite so indulgent, or so that's
Right.
quite interesting to me, because you have already invoked the discourses of romanticism, and I'm thinking about the echoes that we see in this time as well, but also thinking about what's actually possible.
I think that question, I still think about like the question of joy, and it must give pleasure. That still to me is important in poetry. And so navigating those affects, I think there's a trajectory of a lot of people writing in this, from like grief to the apocalyptic, to where do you go and where do you want to land? And I think those are like some of the biggest questions about poetry, and I think about that a lot. But I think there is a creative joy if you do creative work. It's just in there, and then it's but it's those questions: where are you taking people, and where are you landing? So, I wrote an apocalyptic poem, but I wrote it as a comedy, and that helped me manage that. I don't know that it was successful, but that's. I think those are big questions. How can we still be joyous, creative people and do work out of joy and embrace of the world while we also manage all this? I mean, that's a question.
Can you draw a line from Whitmanian subjectivity to Song of?
I would never even dream of drawing a line from Whitman to myself. But Whitman's really interesting in this context, just setting aside that. He really is. The kind of, Jed Razula kind of wrote about this compost and his embrace of disintegration and his biological self and his democratic joy. I mean, he's very interesting in this context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Josh, Whitman?
Whitman, well, just
That's the shortest question I've ever asked.
right. I'll just say Dickinson as my response. No. Shortest answer.
He's in my class, this guy.
But I just as a footnote to that response, I will say I was just reading and mentioned this yesterday to some people. Allen Ginsberg's The Fall of America, and it opens with he's quoting Whitman and trying to say, well, I don't know if this is the same place anymore. And that book is all about driving everywhere, but it's all about gas stations, oil infrastructure, pollution, nuclear, after effects, and he's trying to synthesize it all, and he just can't. But Whitman was definitely an environmental consciousness emerging through all these different kinds of sort of composition and decomposition and recomposition, and now we have to do that with the objects and energies and landscapes we have today.
Footnote, how did Ginsberg get the gas money for that trip that summer, Fall of America?
I was curious about that, and
Anybody know? Bob Dylan.
What? Is that
yeah.
true?
Yeah, Bob Dylan gave him a grant, gave him some
grant.
money to make that trip. Paul?
But what's funny is that he's traveling everywhere and he never is going anywhere. He never tells you that there's like a meeting or anything perfect. He's just moving all constantly.
Yeah.
But he's very mournful about it. He's very elegiac about all this. Can I
Yeah, please.
actually come back to one last thing just about from Julia was asking, because it's very common, you teach and think and write about environmental issues, you constantly get, it's such a downer and it's depressing and, apocalyptic and so on. And sure, but a couple of things is that, you don't have to be melancholic about melancholy in a way. It can be, it's got counter melancholy built into it. And it can be, you can respond to it in so many different ways. The other thing that I always say is it's also, this is stuff for life. It's like, it's just gonna take us all of our lives to figure and think through and write about. It's not a phase. It's, it's hard to, like melancholy structures our lives in crucial and important ways. And we don't wanna get rid of that. We wanna grow with it and think through it. So I don't, for people who say, well, I just want to, get rid of that, and because it is a downer and we should talk about, better things, and nobody wants to join a downer movement. Like, it's not about that momentary feeling, but it's going to be a whole lifetime experience. And what we think and write about should have that long-term perspective built into it. So.
I wanted to ask a question, if I could, staying on the grief note, which I know you were trying to, in a way, move us away from, but I'm teaching a freshman seminar on climate fiction right now, and I have learned that this generation of college students, who are also the age of my own children, they are not only digitally native, but they're climate change native, right? Climate change has never not been a part of the description of the world for them. And we've been talking a lot about grief in this class, but I'm realizing that my grief is different from theirs, right? I mean, those of us who belong to generations where we've had to kind of learn about and internalize species loss, biodiversity loss, and all the rest, our grief work is kind of different from the grief work of people for whom that loss is a kind of native condition. And I wonder what you think ecopoetics today has to say to that generation as opposed to sort of older generations, that generation of climate change natives.
Well, it is different, right? Because it's their inheritance and it's our burden in some ways, or I'm not saying that right, but from my political side, I think the way out of this, it's not that super technology is the answer, but technology, we have the technology to work our ways out of this right now. We don't need anything new, and part of this is like, I like the thing you said about, the human created, the world just is a human modified world now, and we just accept that. And there's maybe a way to, part of the positive side is trying to find the best part of our technological as a utopian instrument versus its dystopian side effects. Like, can we somehow sort that out and use it wisely? Because, things like solar power and wind, they're not even complicated and they're incredibly important. And so, I don't know, I look for that, like the good the human tools we have that are the positive part of that. And maybe that's part of being younger too, is how do you, working forward. I really think doing the work, puts you in a different emotional place. So how do you do that work?
Let's talk about noise for a second. So there's a concept in transition. Josh, in your book you write about noise as an ecological aesthetic using John Cage. Can you say a little more about noise in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, he had a clear, message about any noise can be, first of all, part of the natural environs or, coughing, trucks, traffic.
And beautiful, therefore, if you just listen intently.
If you open your ears.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a massively important, moment to think that.
Can you just say a little more about the ecological aesthetic aspects of that?
Yeah, so
for people who aren't familiar with Cage, for instance.
Yeah, well, we could, there's a lot of people like to say, oh, birdsong might be there's a long history of poetry in birdsong, and that's true, that's great, but just as much as other kinds of crazy noises. And
trucks backfiring.
Yeah, and so, and machine noises and, other kinds of non-human noises permeate the poetic sphere. I mean, even language in some sense is a non-human machine. Making a lot of noise right now. So So Cage is really embracing all of that, and I think it's very powerful.
Evelyn, your thoughts on noise?
Um,
I mean, echolocation, the whole concept is really about using noise as a sounding, discerning thing.
Right, it's also about locating yourself by sound in the dark. And so, but that's one of those grief-stricken figures.
Yeah.
No, I was taken by Josh's discussion of Cage in that way, that, hearing, in some ways, the moment we're in is we have to hear everything, so we're letting in like 100% of the noise because it's part of our situation. And so, although you always ask yourself, what are you culturally suppressing, all the invisible things. So how do you do that Cagean maneuver even with yourself, right, to hear the additional noise, the hidden noise. So I just think that's almost a spiritual exercise, if I can call it that.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you both so much. I had a question that I think it relates to Jean-Michel's earlier question about nature and the place of the human within nature. Really, it just comes down to how do we imagine nature as non-human centered. In de Sade, you still have nature and humans, nature as it affects humans. How do we imagine an ecopoetics or, an eco-poetic critique that either marginalizes or puts the human to the side or extracts us somehow from the human? How do we go forward with that?
Well, it is like one of the great decenterings, right? Great historical decenterings. And yet, because language is human, or some language is human, the way we use language, it's a human project. So there's those contradictions in it. I mean, I've thought about that just as a poet. It's interesting to even try to put yourself there. And sometimes I think, well, does just trying to put think geologic time or think cosmic space, does that help you go there? Or May, will try to think herself, like shift her perspective into the plant. And how long can she stay there? Maybe not very long. It's very difficult as a poetic project. So I don't really know, but it's all, I think, part of this project.
That's great.
I invite each of you to say one thing that you meant to want to say today but didn't have a chance to as a way of wrapping up. Josh, what's on your mind?
Well, I'm always happy to talk about this crazy project that I'm sort of in early stages developing, which does have to do with Will Alexander. And the gist of this argument is simply that, so SETI means the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And and to do that, we're looking for, an unknown, intelligent entity who we have no idea, time and space, cultural connections, how does language work? So many black boxes about anything in terms of communication are at stake in that kind of research. And I argue that it's exactly the same thing in poetics. So we don't know who the poem is going to, how they'll receive it, when, if at all, what are the cultural connections? Will they be in the same world, environmental space? Will poetics even make sense to them? And I think that was embedded in poetics from the very beginning. This project includes contemporary poets, but it includes poets from as far back as Sappho. There's a lot on John Donne, who loved planets and thought about planets all the time in his poetry. But there's also there's a sort of device or trope that I really focus on, which is contact, which is central to SETI. What does contact mean, and what will it be, and if it will ever be? Contact, I think, is crucial in poetics, too. It's actually strangely under-talked about. And I mean the word contact even just there's a sort of Russian linguist kind of theorist named Roman Jakobson, and he says there's 6 functions of language. There's addressee, addresser, code, message, context, and contact. And anytime you're talking, we're in contact. But it doesn't have to be physical. It can be, Sappho's in contact with us 2,000 years later. So contact, most A lot of what poetry does is contact. It doesn't do content necessarily. It does contact. And it's saturated with contact. It's contact rich, much more than it maybe even is, connotative or denotative. And a lot of times you're just sitting, even with the poem, you're like, what the hell does this mean? Well, you were just in contact with that for quite a while, and that was the primary thing you were supposed to be doing. So I'm really, fascinated to study that if you'll device or function as crucial for poetics and ecopoetics going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Josh. Evelyn?
Well, actually, maybe this is an extrapolation of Josh's Poetics of Contact, which I've been thinking about, but it's his writing about it. But I think I love that concept, and part of the reason is I think a lot of people assume that you come to this kind of work through science, and I think that was also the first early environmental instinct. Well, this is a scientific project, and I think it's a science-informed project, but it's actually a cultural project about cultural and social will, and in terms of addressing climate, it's not so much a scientific project, although it has that aspect. And I think for poetry, I was trained as a zoologist, so I was kind of comfortable with some of this world. But more and more, I've been interested in the social aspects of how poetry is part of our connecting in a way that we can find social will and a way to work together and move forward. So, and I think somewhere in writing about the Poetics of Contact, you talk about a lot of poems, you can't even, your main experience has been the contact. You can't even articulate back what it was or any other aspect of it, but the experience of the contact stays with you. Yeah. And I think there's something very powerful in that idea. So I like the fact that you've kind of gotten me thinking about that.
Thank you both.